Welcome to yet another biography event. My name is Kai Bird, and I am the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in the year 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support to the Biography Center. It is her vision that makes this program possible. Please note that our next event will take place on January 20th, when Julian Zelizer will talk about his new biography of Rabbi Abraham Heschel. He will be in conversation with the Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer David Blight. Please mark your calendars and register for this event on the Leon Levy website. And please encourage your friends and relatives to subscribe to our digital mailing list on our website. But tonight I'm delighted to introduce Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Richard Rhodes, who will be talking about his new biography of E.O. Wilson with Simon Winchester. Since tonight we have not one but two writers who are towering figures in the field of science writing, I think it is only appropriate to remind our viewers that the Leon Levy Center has been making a special effort in recent years to support the work of men and women who try to explain the values of science and scientific lives. With the support of the Alfred Sloan Foundation, we are now offering a fifth $72,000 fellowship devoted to a biographer working on a scientific figure. The next deadline for this and our 4 regular biography fellowships is on January 4th. So please get out the word to all biographers. Richard Rhodes is the author or editor of 22 books, including Twilight of the Bomb, the last volume in a quartet about nuclear history. The first, The Making of the Atomic Bomb, won the Pulitzer Prize, a National Book Award, and a National Book Critics Circle Award. He has received numerous fellowships for research and writing, including grants from the Ford Foundation, the Guggenheim Foundation, the MacArthur, and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. Simon Winchester is the acclaimed author of many books, including The Professor and the Madman, The Men Who United the States, The Map That Changed the World, The Man Who Loved China, A Crack in the Edge of the World, and Krakatoa, all of which were New York Times bestsellers and appeared on numerous best and notable lists. In 2006, Winchester was made an Officer of the Order of the British Empire, OBE, by Her Majesty the Queen, but he resides in Western Massachusetts. His latest book, Land: How the Hunger for Ownership Shaped the Modern World, was published in January of 2021. Please look for The Scientist at bookshops.org, a site that will lead you to your local independent bookstore. Rhodes and Winchester will be in conversation for about 40 minutes, and then we will take questions from our virtual audience. Please click on the question box below to type in your questions, and Simon will be sure to get to as many as he can. We will try to end this program after about 1 hour. Again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation and Shelby White for funding this and all our other events. And now I turn this conversation over to Simon Winchester. And I should also mention that this event, for technical reasons, is slightly truncated. So you will now see the event virtually jumping in a few minutes into the program. Thank you.
Let him fill in later, and he describes in one of his memoirs sitting as a young assistant professor later in a calculus class with some of his students trying to learn calculus, which he'd somehow managed to avoid all the years prior to that time. So
how long did it take him from when he initially got to Harvard to achieve tenure? Because he was initially, I believe, offered tenure track position at the California University, Stanford, I think. And then Harvard said, no, wait a minute, we want to keep this chap.
Yes. Well, he was invited to join the very prestigious junior fellowship at Harvard, which was for the most creative and talented young postdocs, basically, graduate students and postdocs, people of all kinds, Daniel Ellsberg. I could make quite a long list. So, and it was from that he spent 3 years as a young Harvard student, graduate student. Then he was offered a chance that was really a great breakthrough for him, and that was to go collecting across the South Pacific for 9 months or a year with all his expenses paid to put together a first-class collection of ant species for the Harvard Museum of Natural History. That was a glorious 9 months. He was collecting on islands in the South Pacific where no one had ever collected before. He brought back more than 1,000 new species of ants from that glorious summer. And at the same time, because he had been about to marry a young dance instructor whom he had met trying to learn to dance so he could meet the girls, he pledged to her that if she would write him every day of the time he was gone, he would do the same.
When I'm interested as a biographer, Richard, did you have access to those letters?
Well,
there were a lot of them.
Ed is immensely private about his private life. But when I talked with him about doing his biography, I knew about the letters, and I told him, I can't do this biography unless you let me read those letters and quote from them. And a week or two later, when I got back home, I got this box in the mail filled with the usual kind of scrunched up, torn up blue airmail letters that people throw in a box after they've read them, and opened them all up and copied them all and had them transcribed. It was not only a lovely, lovely love exchange between two people who have been happily married up until Irene's death about 4 months ago, at the age of 97 in her case, but it was also a chronicle of every day almost in this summer of collecting that he pursued across the Pacific to Vanuatu, where he met the original family that were the basis for the French Planter in South Pacific, the musical, and spent time living with them while he collected in the rainforest. He worked in Australia trying to track down what was called the dawn ant, which had never been collected, but was a wasp-like creature that was somewhere between the original primitive wasp that was the origin of the whole ant clade. They didn't find it, but it was found a dozen years later by another scientist. So, and even up into Papua New Guinea and places where no white person had probably ever walked before. So it was a wonderful summer, and it put him on the map. And he was invited not merely to be a young teacher at Harvard, but a tenure track instructor.
Well, let's stop at that moment, because there was another tenure track or tenured professor researcher who had arrived at Harvard at about the same time, and that is James Watson.
Yes.
And who had lately come from Cambridge, where he and Francis Crick, of course, had unraveled, along with Rosalind Franklin, it has to be said, the structure of DNA. And for that, of course, they were to win the Nobel Prize a few years later. But Watson was hostile, was he not, to Wilson? It's rather confusing names. But for what reason? He derided him and his like as mere stamp collectors.
Yes, exactly. Watson was so enthusiastic about the possibilities of molecular biology, and maybe more to the point, was concerned at the sheer volume of assistants and technical experts and so forth, not to mention equipment, that he would need to expand the range of molecular biology, that he wanted to clean out the biology department at Harvard of people who, and it's true, many of them had kind of settled down to a comfortable life where they had one species that was theirs, that they protected from all approach by others, and that's what they studied and that's what they taught. Watson considered that just beneath the pale, and approached it with an enormous amount of ego, not surprising, I mean, even Wilson says of Watson, and they're friends now, but for a long time they were mortal enemies. Even Wilson, during that period, would say, I understand that he's made the most basic discovery in biology since Darwin, he and his colleagues, and I respect that enormously. But that doesn't mean he has a right to come in and destroy a biology program. More to the point, Ed's a field biologist. And he understood that the organismic level, if you will, what's now called evolutionary biology at Harvard, was different from and required a different set of tools from molecular biology, that you couldn't learn everything in the laboratory by studying molecules, that you needed to see the interaction of whole living organisms. Watson scoffed at that, and so Ed ends up calling Watson the Caligula of biography. And then comes this terrible moment for Watson when Ed, because he kind of forced the issue at the age of 29 when Stanford, which was just then building a fresh new, hopefully internationally recognized biology department, invited him on as I think, assistant professor, perhaps associate professor. In any case, as soon as Harvard got wind that they might lose one of their champions, they offered Ed the equivalent tenure before Watson. And Watson famously walked through the halls saying either shit, shit, shit,
Yeah.
or fuck, 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 depending on who told me the story, one of those four-letter words, because he was just so amazed that someone else had beat him to it. But of course, Watson got his tenure the next year and everybody went on from there. And then, like a religion where the fundamental theology is disagreed on, they couldn't compromise. So the department split into two departments, one of molecular biology and one of what was called evolutionary and organismal biology. And they went off to their separate sides of the building, if you will.
And interestingly, they eventually did get on and become reasonably good friends. I mean, I went to Watson's 90th birthday party in New York, and he was still a pretty prickly individual. I mean, he was gracious enough in a birthday party, but people were still somewhat scared of him. And of course, he had left the Cold Spring Lab, and there were all these suggestions that he was too flirtatious and vulgar and so on and so forth. But let's leave him and for a moment, because I keep an eye on the clock, leave field biology for the moment, because there comes an important shift in Ed Wilson's life and career and thinking when, while going on the train, because Irene, by whom he was now married and they had a daughter, she didn't like him traveling by air. And so he would make the journey from Cambridge, Massachusetts down to Florida to do field work on the train. And legendarily, he read a paper by a man called Hamilton, I think I got the name right, about kin selection, about genetics and so forth. So explain, if you will, in words that I can understand, what this prompted in Wilson's mind that led him to write one of his most famous books, Sociobiology. So what happened on the train and what was the paper about?
Ed had started out, after he finished this vast work of collection, had started out doing experimental work on ants and had made a crucial discovery, probably his best discovery, which was how ants talk to each other, how they communicate. Then, as he kind of rounded out his work on ants, he began to be interested in the social relationships. Ants, of course, being a social organism. All of the invertebrates that he was studying were wasps, termites. He was interested in whether or not it was possible to look at the connections among organisms in the social context, not merely as individuals. Once he'd figured out how an individual ant lays a scent trail for other ants to follow and so forth. Hamilton's paper, which was much derided when it first appeared, as is usually the case with really breakthrough ideas, had to do with the social relations among species and individuals within a species and how all that works. And Ed was, and in fact, it specifically implied that there were genetic connections that could be traced such that you would be more interested in being altruistic toward a fellow ant that was one of your sisters than you would, well, ants are not a good example. Let me think of something else here. You are more likely to provide altruistic support to individuals within your species that are related to you more closely. I think it was J.B.S. Haldane who phrased it as, I would give my life for 2 first cousins or 8 second cousins, something like that. The point being that the relationship of altruism was partly at least genetically based. Ed found that absolutely absurd for the first half of the train ride and resisted it mightily with every argument he could think of. But he said, by the time I got to Tampa or Miami, wherever he was going, I was convinced. I was transformed. I believed him. And
this business about, if I can interrupt you,
yeah.
There was this feeling about how altruism was disseminated through kin rather than through large groups was augmented by the familial tragedy he had suffered with the suicide of his father. It was his father, if I got it right from your book, that Ed essentially said, you're drinking far too much and I have to look after you. I've got to divert myself from my studies to look after you. And his father left home and shot himself.
Yes.
And Ed's belief was that he shot himself for altruistic reasons, in order to enable his immediate kin, his tribe, his family, his genetically related subgroup to enjoy a better life. So that was an example of what Hamilton was writing about. Am I right?
Yes, absolutely, at least in part. Ed also saw that his father didn't want to become what his father called a Bowery bum, that he didn't want to deteriorate to the point where he was stumbling around the streets. But there was that sense, perhaps more in Ed than his father, but these things are not necessarily conscious anyway. But Ed had to find a way to explain to himself what his father was doing, and what he finally found was the belief that his act was a courageous act, and at least in part because it allowed Ed to go away to school and open up the family to this larger world that it had never been a part of. He was the first person in his family to go to college.
Yeah, well, this led, if I can put it in shorthand, led ultimately to Ed writing this huge 900-page book, I think it was, called Sociobiology, basically creating a new science about the genetic relationship with animal behavior. Exactly. And this, if I remember rightly, had 27 chapters, of which the first 26 were the animal world, or the non-human animal world, and then come 27th chapter, which expanded this view to humankind, and that resulted in a controversy which rocked the biological world to its foundations. Tell us about that.
This was a book about vertebrate life. He had already done one called The Insect Societies that covered basically everything known about insects up to the time he finished the book, 1971. But then he wanted to have a comparable book on the shelves about vertebrate creatures, but he asked around for who would write it, and nobody wanted to take it on. So he decided he would have to. He originally didn't plan to include the human species at all. It just seemed maybe a step too far, I think, probably. And if you read the book now, in the light of all that followed, that chapter 27 about humanity is remarkably, what should I say? It's not a great challenge to our pride in our species and our belief that we're somehow a little lower than the angels. It just looks at some things that pretty obviously many societies have in common, the incest taboo and so forth, and suggests that there's a genetic basis, not directly in the sense that one gets a particular hair color from one's immediate kin, but in the indirect sense that there might be learning rules that are hardwired, that there might be certain kinds of abilities to look at certain things in a certain way that are hardwired. Nothing at all that should have shocked anybody, I think, who's ever been around other human beings or who's had raised children and seen them born with various qualities that seem to have come along with their birth.
And yet it did totally shock certain members of the biological community. They set up this sociobiology study group, a
Yes.
group of many of them Marxists, Richard Lewontin, and what's his name? Well, anyway, other leading
Yes.
biologists wrote this letter to the New York Review of Books denouncing sociobiology, and then the controversy got worse and worse and worse, did it not?
Denouncing it in the most terrible terms. I wanted to quote that paragraph or just that one. This is what they said in the New York Review of Books. Stephen Jay Gould, Richard Lewontin, and a number of other Marxists. Now, the point being, these were Marxists, and they were horrified by the notion that there might be some aspects of human life that are hardwired, because that would contradict their belief in the total possibility of a total transformation of society within one revolution, if you will. They needed a tabula rasa at birth so that they could see imposed upon that a Marxist view of how life should be. This is what they wrote. Wilson's theory, which has no scientific support, he had just published a book with 900 pages and almost 2,000 references. I sat one evening and counted them one by one so I could be sure just how many sources he had for his arguments. Linked with those that provided an important basis for the enactment of sterilization laws and restrictive immigration laws by the United States. And then this is the really killer sentence. And also for the eugenics policies which led to the establishment of gas chambers in Nazi Germany.
That was a quite extraordinary thing to say. And of course, it got worse. That was in 76 or 77. By 78, Ed Wilson giving a speech to the Anthropological Association, I think, and someone came up from behind and tipped a barrel of ice water over him and said, Wilson's a wet, or whatever it was. So it was a vicious attack. Let me just ask you directly, from your knowledge of the man, is E.O. Wilson a eugenicist?
Oh, to the contrary. I would say he's probably as broad-minded a human being as I've ever met. I mean, he has written about his own life, of course, several memoirs. He points out that he was a perfect racist by the time he was 13 years old because he grew up in Alabama. And one of the things that was really great for him was when he went to Harvard for his graduate study, his roommate was from, I think, Ghana or Liberia. And it gave him a chance to expand his understanding of other human beings from other cultures and other ethnicities. So no, to the contrary, I think he has been someone who dramatically went the other way with the benefit of the science that helped him understand the world. So there was very little basis for this. Certainly there was some departmental jealousies going on here because Gould was at Harvard. Lewontin was, well, no, Gould wasn't at Harvard, but Lewontin was. And Ed was something of a star at Harvard by then, of course. It shook him at first. He really went through several days after that initial letter in the New York Review where he questioned whether he had ruined his life, whether he was going to be drummed out of the scientific profession and laughed at in classes and so forth. But he said, then I got angry and I looked at the basis for my arguments again, and I realized that I had perfectly solid scientific evidence to support the claims I was making. And he said,
well, and indeed, he's not only outlived the controversy, but outlived, of course, both Gould and Lewontin. But as I understand, I don't want to linger too long because I want to move on briefly to biodiversity and his more recent books, Consilience and so forth. But the controversy, has it not, has revitalized itself because he's come down in favor. Have I lost you or something?
No, I'm here.
No, you're still there. It seems that, as far as I understand from my friend Nicholas Wade, who you'll know very well, and of course is a close friend and ally of E.O. Wilson, that Wilson has recently sort of looked again at this, the whole business of group versus kin evolution, or you know what I'm talking about. Has he changed his mind? I think that's what I'm asking you. In recent years,
he recently proposed that rather than something so Darwinian as direct kin selection, that the selection process in large groups is group selection, which Darwin never supported. So he's taken, someone said Ed Wilson's a bit of a bomb thrower. He comes up with remarkably transformative proposals and ideas and supports them very well. But they cause something like an ant colony being disturbed in the scientific community when he does. He feels that there's plenty of evidence that there is a group selection process that goes on that's independent of any direct kin line sort of process. That's new, relatively new. 2015, I think, was when he published that. But by then, he had already undergone, the outcome of all this controversy was a real distaste for fighting these battles over and over again about sociobiology. He felt that he'd presented it. There were ultimately 3 books on the subject that he wrote. He felt actually 4, now I think of it, one of which was for the general population and won a Pulitzer Prize, his first Pulitzer. That was the book called On Human Nature, which is an absolutely glorious book and a glorious read. He decided to shift gears a bit in 1980. He had traditionally, like most biologists, believed that there was indeed a decline in the number of species in the world because of human activity. But the number that had been presented and everyone had kind of accepted was the loss of 1 species a year. Somewhere in the late 70s, some work was done that indicated that indeed the loss was more like 1 species a day. And when he really absorbed that, Ed jumped on the bandwagon about doing something about it. He had not been an activist before. He hadn't really believed scientists should be activists. But now he saw and was supported in part by some others in his field who were more active, politically, I mean, and stepped forward to make a case for doing everything possible to preserve the species remaining in the world. There were several ways that he tried to do that. He tried to get a government program going with the United States government at the rate of about 50 million a year to educate a large number of biologists who would, as he put it, finish the great Linnaean project of identifying all the species in the world. There are about estimated to be 10 million species in the world of all kinds. I think that may just be on land, actually. And some millions of that number have never been named or necessarily even found, much less studied and identified and categorized. He wanted to see that happen. The government ultimately, the Congress didn't think that was a worthy use of money. Then his next project, which everyone can look at right now if they want to, was a glorious project called the Encyclopedia of Life, which is at least one page on the World Wide Web for each species, giving its name, its characteristics, and references to everything that's known about that species. That project is ongoing, has been translated into school textbooks, has now tens of thousands of species aboard, including man, which is one of the more amusing pages to look at because man is treated like just another bug or another mammal. So he keeps trying to find ways to do this, and in the process has written what was probably his full flowering as a writer. After he retired from Harvard in 1998, he started writing books for the general public. And they're wonderful, wonderful books. They're books on the connections between the sciences. They're memoirs about his own experiences as a scientist. They are.
Well, he wrote a novel, didn't he? Didn't he write a novel called Ant Hill?
Sorry?
Didn't he write a novel
He
called Ant Hill? What was that all about? Ants, I imagine.
I think he just was casting about for something to do and didn't have a scientific project right up front at the time. So he thought, well, I can write a novel. And it's about a young man living down in Alabama who tries to save a little piece of wilderness and finds a way to do it. But included in the novel, rather awkwardly, is a little story about an ant colony changing queens, where the ants all talk and run back and forth and go out and mate and do all those great things. It's really quite a charming book. I wouldn't say it's a great novel. I think his best book for the general reader is probably On Human Nature, but other books as well along the way. So he has.
What do you think, as we're talking about diversity on Earth, and maybe you'll make some mention of the Half Earth project, what do you think he would think, maybe you know, of Elon Musk's idea of ultimately transporting a male and a female of every species of vertebrate to Mars, which is, maybe you didn't read it, but sort of cockamamie idea we read about last week. He would be appalled, I imagine.
Well, Ed's point of view is there are plenty of alien forms on Earth that we haven't even identified yet. Why don't we deal with those first? He likes to point out that in one of his books, he says if a Martian landed on Earth, the first thing a good Martian scientist would do is start categorizing all the different species. And we haven't even done our own yet. So I don't think he would think very much of that. He wants to, his project for what he calls the Half Earth Project is straightforward. It's, if we lose a piece of rainforest, that's gone for maybe 100 years and could be put back. If we lose a species, it's gone forever. It takes 1 million years or more to evolve a new species. Therefore, we should be trying to save those pieces of wilderness that are left in the world where these species abide in order to preserve the species themselves. Because in them is all the variety, is all of the possibility for food, for an environment, livable environment, and all the rest of the things that we think of when we think of having a world with the natural piece of it, as well as the man-made world. That's his campaign.
Tell us also about this relatively recent book with the peculiar name Consilience. What's that all about?
I have a feeling that echoes all the way back to his conflicts with Watson at Harvard. Consilience is about pulling together under the rubric of the fundamental of biology, which is evolution, Darwinian evolution, all of the related sciences so that they are supported by each other, talk to each other. He, for example, sociobiology really offended the sociologists because they saw that Ed was basically saying sociology doesn't have an evolutionary foundation. It's based on observations at a different level. But without the evolutionary foundation, then it's not fully supported scientifically. They need sociobiology, he argued, in order to anchor their social science in the biological science that's underneath it. They were quite offended. So were the anthropologists for similar reasons.
I can imagine. I mean, the whole business of, if you believe the genetic influence on behavior,
Yes.
whether it's 10% or 40% or whatever science believes, or some aspects of science, believe it to be, this drives a horse and cart through the world of philosophy, the world of psychology, psychotherapy. I mean, all these are in danger, are they not, if the gene is allowed to flourish as the causal element behind it all?
Well, in danger only in the sense that they might have to grow up, particularly scathing about philosophy, which he
Right.
almost in Watsonian terms as sort of armchair things rather than anchoring philosophy in the basic biology of human society. It's all there. It's a lot of it's already been dug up and organized. So why ignore it in exchange for a kind of ad hoc invention of the anchors of philosophy? He just doesn't see the point of what he thinks of as airy speculation rather than something that's anchored in real science. Understand, he went through this cleansing process himself. He saw that biology, his kind of biology, needed to be anchored in molecular biology, needed a basis in mathematics, needed to expand beyond the stamp collecting, if you will, into a more integrated and more solidly formed science. That's why he teamed up with Robert MacArthur, who was a mathematician basically and a biologist, to find the mathematical structures behind the way islands are colonized in the world and so forth. And they
So, well, Richard, as we're coming to the end of this fascinating but all too brief discussion, a couple of questions. Well, some of the questions I've asked recently, what do you think of Ant Hill? Was he a Southerner? I think we've agreed he has all the courtesy, good manners, quietude of a Southerner. I think you would have accepted that in his youth anyway. He was a racist, not anymore, one assumes. What is his religious take? After all these, he's what, 93 years old. How does he feel about God?
Well, he went through a religious transformation as a teenage boy. He discovered Jesus and was baptized, but it was at about the same time that he was lifted out of the baptismal tank in front of the Southern Baptist Church that he realized that there was something really wrong. He describes it as he had this perfect crystal sphere in his hand, and then he discovered it had a crack in it. So he really is, I would say, I don't think he'd call himself an atheist, but he doesn't believe in God as such. What he does find interesting is that religion has had such a deep and profound influence on humanity over the eons. He points out that there are something like 100,000 religions in the world, and that many different religions aren't there just by accident or because someone decided to have a vision one day. They obviously serve profound sociological, sociobiological purposes. And it's that he finds interesting. And it became a way for him to welcome into the world, if you will, and welcome himself into the world of religion. I mean, he's sympathetic with it. He knows how it feels. He knows what good it has done as well as what evil it has done.
I
So,
must say I'm struck by, and I'm going to
rubric of
bring this to an end now, but a line on, I think it's page 172 of your book, quoting from somebody else, I think, where he says that man regrettably would rather believe than know.
yes.
He was very much a person that believed in knowing rather than believing. So you would agree with that, would you not?
Well, let's just take the opening of this wonderful book on human nature, where he says we will eventually get past the problem of global warming, problem of population growth, problem of living in a finite world and living in a balanced way. We'll get past the problem of human disease and so on. When we do, he says, perhaps sometime in the 22nd century, we will wake up one morning with a larger religious crisis than we had with Darwin or than we had with Copernicus. We will wake up and realize that we have no purpose in the universe beyond the reproduction of our own kind, just like all the other organisms in the world. And he sees that as a real existential crisis in the context of what Camus was talking about when he opens that book by quoting Camus about the only real logical thing in the world is suicide. So, so, so not a religious believer, and in fact aware that there's a deeply tragic view of life that underlies this need to believe rather than know.
Well, that's for 2022. In the meantime, we have to celebrate his joy in the life that he has discovered and written about. I'm going to bring this to an end, Richard Rhodes. This has been a fascinating discussion. It could have gone on for very much longer. So I'm going to, because I think our Zoom connection will probably die any moment. Thank you very much indeed. It's been fascinating talking to you. And I'm going to have to thank also, and I'm happy and willing to do so, to thank the Leon Levy Center and Shelby White for sponsoring this event. So thank you, Richard Rhodes, very much indeed.
Thank you.
And to everyone,
All
good
of
night, and to you, sir.
listening for joining us.